Good evening, everybody. Welcome in. On behalf of the Bermuda National Trust, I'd like to welcome you to our very first Trust Talk for 2025. My name is Anna Stevenson. I'm the Heritage Education Coordinator at the Trust, and I have the pleasure of organising our Trust Talks. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mark, and then we're going to make a start. Mark Alderson is the son of Roly Alderson and the author of the newly published book, Flying Boat Pilot in War and Peace, Disaster and Survival, The Extraordinary Life of Captain M.J.R Roly Alderson. And he will be talking about the circumstances surrounding the loss of the Cavalier and give a brief account of Alderson's long career in aviation, from his first flight in a World War I biplane to his involvement with the supersonic Concorde. You couldn't get two further planes apart, I think. We do have quite an international audience here tonight, which is wonderful. And so without further ado, I'll hand over to Mark.
Thank you, Anna. Thanks very much. Before we start on the presentation as such, if you can see it, this is the book.
Remember the middle.
This is the book that it's based on, and it forms a fairly large part of this book, an important part of the book. So I just wanted to show you that before we start. Okay, well, I'm going to start the presentation. Where do I go for that now?
So if you press escape, that'll get rid of that. Click on that screen. So we need to go to share on there. Okay. And then screen two. Okay. And then share. Okay.
Right.
So people can see that one now. So you can work on this one.
Yep. Okay, we're there. So firstly, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Anna Stevenson of the Bermuda National Trust for inviting me, and also Meredith Ebbin of Bermuda Biographies for facilitating it. I'm never entirely comfortable with IT, but I'm lucky enough to have a right-hand man here with me, Gary Thompson, who will do his best to keep me on track. In fact, it was Gary, together with an author friend, Tom Burgess, who was the author of Kleptopia, The Looting Machine, Cuckoo Land, amongst others. The two of them together persuaded me to write the book. They were responsible for persuading me to write this book in the first place. So if you don't enjoy this evening, you can blame them. And if you don't like flying, then maybe this evening is not for you. Okay, this biography of my father's remarkable life was published in November 2024, so just a couple of months ago. Captain Roly Alderson was commanding the Imperial Airways flying boat Cavalier when it came down in the Atlantic en route to Bermuda from New York on the 21st of January 1939. The talk this evening centres on this incident, which forms a central plank of the book and which has become part of Bermuda's 20th century folklore. So when I was a young boy, back in the 50s and 60s, our family often visited Bermuda for our holidays. Sometimes we stayed at Homestead, which some of you at Bermuda will know of, and sometimes at Mount Pleasant. You can see the picture there, the home of friends of my father. And in fact, I believe they were also benefactors of the Bermuda National Trust in later years. At that age, I didn't appreciate the significance of Bermuda in my father's past, nor did I understand the attentions of the newspaper reporters. We always met up with a lady by the name of Edna Watson on these visits, but of course at that time the important part she had played in my father's life escaped me. My father learned to fly with the Cambridge University Air Squadron. His first flight was in 1927 in a World War I Avro Lynx like this one. In fact, this was the actual machine in which he first flew solo a few months later. Roly spent as much time as he could in the air, and he toured Europe in his little de Havilland Gypsy Moth, mostly with a friend of his, ranging as far as Poland and Italy. He was even invited on one occasion to dine with officers of the Luftwaffe when he dropped in on Berlin. Fortunately, he had packed his dinner jacket. This clip that I'm about to show you was used a few years ago in a television documentary, hence the voiceover.
Days at Cambridge in the 20s, he was one of the first to film air-to-air. Only recently discovered, this film, never seen in public before, shows the site of what was to become London Airport years later.
So rather fun, I thought. That was when we just started. Hold on. I'll get back to the right one. That one. That's a selfie, rather an early selfie, about 1930. And the cinefilm was done on a 16mm cine camera. He was a very keen photographer.
Today.
Okay. So, sorry, I seem to have gone ahead. Okay, Imperial Airways had been formed in 1924. The pilots were without exception ex-Royal Flying Corps. In 1933, new routes were being planned across the empire, so Imperial now needed more pilots. Roly applied and was the only civilian pilot to be recruited. What he really wanted to do was to fly boats, which is what they called them in those days, flying boats. But he had to wait another 3 years for his chance. Roly spent most of his time plying the route between Cairo and Singapore. Near the end of this posting, he was selected to fly the Viceroy of India, Lord Willingdon, on his farewell tour of India. He was in command of the Viceroy's personal machine, shown here, visiting the various Maharajas across India. Roly had been away from the UK for nearly 3 years. On his return, after 6 weeks of accumulated leave, he went down to the Hamble River near Southampton, where he began his flying boat conversion course. In fact, on this actual machine, the rather comical-looking Saunders Roe Cutty Sark, or Saro A-17, its official name. After a few flights in this little aircraft, it was time to tackle something a little bit bigger. This was the Shorts brothers' S8 Calcutta, and as you can see, this machine had an open cockpit, so it must have been very cold and noisy. In fact, when new, this particular machine had been landed on the Thames and moored opposite the Houses of Parliament for inspection by members of both the Commons and the Lords, including the then Chancellor, Winston Churchill, who incidentally later developed a soft spot for flying boats, but more of that a little bit later. This particular boat was destroyed in a storm off Crete just 6 months after Roly completed his conversion course. So less than 4 weeks later, after some 30 hours of flying, Roly was signed off and ready for service. Oops. Sorry. Unfortunately for him, however, he was needed elsewhere. Due to the rapidly growing demand for Imperial's new routes across Europe, Roly spent the next 12 months flying, amongst other machines, the rather elegant de Havilland Express, which was a cousin to the perhaps better known Dragon Rapide. Very elegant little aircraft. Finally, in June 1937, he was rostered onto the new flying boat route to Durban, following the Nile down through Africa, and also to Malaya via Alexandria, Bahrain, India, and Burma. He finished this tour in April and returned to England, April 38, this is, for there was a new challenge afoot. In May, you probably recognize that, Darrell's Island. In May 1938, Rowley found himself in Bermuda, in command of the Empire-class boat, the RMA Cavalier, RMA standing for Royal Mail Aeroplane. The Bermuda to New York run was Imperial's flagship service, and the only transocean one. It had taken a huge effort to establish, not least of which, apart from the facilities, the hangar, the slipways, was the reassembling of the Cavalier itself, which was freighted on a ship in 23 crates and reassembled by the Imperial Airways chief engineer, Len Turnhill. Took about 2 months, just under 2 months, to rebuild it from all these bits and pieces. Anyway, by as I say, after a couple of months, it was ready. So Rowley soon settled into his bachelor existence there and enjoyed the company of a small but close circle of friends. Amongst them, names that will ring bells with some of you in Bermuda, George and Frida Wardman. Frida was of the Bermuda Smith family, and after George died, she became Frida Chappell. They were from Mount Pleasant. George was the manager of the Pan Am flying boat service, which ran in tandem with Imperial Airways. Then there was Taffy and Marion Powell. Taffy was the Imperial Airways manager there and was also an experienced flying boat pilot who would occasionally stand in for Rowley because Rowley was the only pilot there. So it was quite handy to have Taffy on hand to do the odd flight. And then Zandi and Mary Frith of Salt Kettle, another old Bermuda family, amongst others. So when not flying, he made most of the opportunities that this delightful little island offered: swimming, fishing, golf, tennis, sailing. Oh, sorry. Oh, pressing the wrong button. He even bought himself a sailing dinghy in the States, which he brought over in the Cavalier's hold. This is a picture of the dinghy, core shiver, in the hold. At first, all went well, but as winter approached, Rowley started to report engine issues. These problems continued intermittently, and he reported them back to London, insisting that an urgent solution be found. Here are a couple of shots showing the interior of the Cavalier. In the picture on the left, you may just be able to spot a silver whistle, rather like a footballer's referee's whistle, hanging on the instrument panel. This was used to signal to the bowman when he picked up or dropped off the mooring buoy. And you can just see my father's shoulder on the left-hand side. So these boats were very spacious and comfortable, affording luxury accommodation for up to 20 or so passengers. White-coated stewards served hot meals on bone china plates, and the tables were set with silver cutlery, crystal glasses, and linen tablecloths. Incidentally, the meals served on the Bermuda to New York leg were prepared by kitchen staff at the Belmont Manor Hotel and ferried out to the aircraft where they were kept warm in special heated cabinets. This was very much first class and certainly only affordable by the super rich. The issues which had been dogging the engines continued under certain atmospheric conditions. And being an engineer by training, Rowley had a very good idea what the problem was. He wrote a final and very detailed warning letter to London just before he took off for New York on the 20th of January 1939. The following morning at 10:42, after a scheduled overnight stop in New York, the RMA Cavalier took off once more from Port Washington, bound for Bermuda. The passenger list that morning was as follows: Mr. and Mrs. Miller from Nebraska, Mr. and Mrs. Noakes from New York, Mr. Talbot from Massachusetts, Mrs. Edna Watson from Bermuda, he was in fact Canadian, Mrs. Catherine Honey Ingham from Bermuda, Miss Nellie Tucker Smith, Bermuda, and the crew list read as follows: Captain Roly Alderson, Commander, Neil Richardson, First Officer and Co-Pilot, Patrick Chapman, Radio Officer, David Williams, Chief Steward and Purser, and Robert Bobby Spence, Second Steward. Initially, the flight proceeded as normal. They were barely 2 hours into the flight at an altitude of a little over 9,000 feet when the engines began to fade. And to cut a long story short, after battling in vain for half an hour to restore power, this time they failed to recover. Roly ordered a pan-pan signal to be sent out, and soon after, when he realized that a ditching was inevitable, this was followed by a mayday. They came down in a heavy swell, and the plane broke its back. It should be remembered that these machines were designed to take off and land in sheltered waters. They were not built to withstand landing in mid-ocean. And there was quite a swell running. They managed to get everyone out before it broke in two and slipped beneath the waves. They were together in the cold Atlantic waters for over 10 hours, during which time 3 souls were lost. This is not the place to go into all the circumstances surrounding the ditching, as well as the tragic loss of life, but it is related in detail in the book. This is a Movietone news report of the loss of the Cavalier.
This time off the coast of America. Here, the Imperial Airways flying boat Cavalier is ending one of her flights from Bermuda to Long Island. Alas, on another such flight, outward bound to Bermuda, her engines failed and she was forced to come down in heavy weather 150 miles out at sea. Wireless told the whole story. By wireless, the position of the great liner was learned. Wireless announced the rescue of her survivors by the American tanker S.O. Baytime.
Okay, so for the report is correct, actually, apart from the distance. She came down not 150 miles from New York, but about 285 miles. So for over 10 hours, the survivors joined together in a circle, supported only by a ring of life jackets strung together. Edna Watson was the life and soul of the group, massaging cramped muscles and encouraging them all to sing. She never gave up. Roly Alderson had been injured and became unconscious. He had given his life preserver to another passenger, but Edna saved his life by holding his head above the water until they were rescued. Edna Watson was the real heroine of this tragedy and was later awarded the Royal Humane Society Silver Medal for her bravery. I'm hoping I can now invite Michael Hayes, if he's there, to speak a bit about his Aunt Edna. He's coming in from Montreal in Canada, I believe. Are you there, Michael?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
I can. Lovely to see you. Lovely to meet you.
Thanks, Mark. Hello, everyone. I'm in Montreal, Canada, actually. Mark has been talking about my aunt. Edna Watson, the heroine who saved Captain Roly Alderson's life, was my aunt. She was born in Montreal, Canada in 1985, but she lived most of her life in Bermuda. She was a remarkable lady, brave, courageous, adventurous, accomplished, and very strong-willed. She also had a very imposing stature. She became a physiotherapist and served in both world wars. She lied about her age to enlist, as she was too young to enlist in the First World War and too old for the Second. In addition to the Cavalier crash, she later survived again when a warship she was on was torpedoed by the Germans and sank in the Mediterranean Ocean during the Second World War. After the Second World War, she traveled the world extensively, but principally in Asia, on freighters. She was often entertained and treated royally by the Canadian ambassadors in the countries she visited. These ambassadors had previously been treated by her as a physiotherapist on the front lines during the war. In Bermuda, she and her husband ran a farm and guest house, Scarrington, on Middle Road, Paget, and after her husband died prematurely, she built a house, Harbor Lights, on Harbor Road in Paget. She became one of the first 2 women elected to the Bermuda Parliament and was the first to serve as a chairman of a board. A portrait of Edna hangs currently in the Bermuda Parliament. I was only 6 years old at the time of the Cavalier crash, and because of her living in Bermuda, her wartime service, and world travels, I did not get to know Edna until the 1970s, at which time she was already in her 70s. She had no children of her own, and in her earlier days, she thought I and my sister were brats and a nuisance. However, we became very close in her last few years, and I and my wife and 3 children had many happy times with her at her home, Harbor Lights in Paget, and on her Christmas visits to Montreal. She was entertaining, fun to be with, and enjoyed a good party and good company. She was in some ways a lady from a different era, a grande dame. She liked to be treated as a lady as well. As an example, when you took her out for dinner, she would review the menu and tell you what she would like, but leave the ordering up to you. She was a nurse, physiotherapist, wartime veteran, survivor of 2 disasters, heroine, parliamentarian, and social activist. She died in Bermuda in 1976 at age 81 and is buried at St. Paul's Church, Paget. That's a very short and sweet comment about her. For anyone who's interested and hasn't seen it already, Meredith Eben has written an excellent biography of Edna on her website, Bermuda Biographies. Mark, back to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was great. Really fills in and shows what an amazing person she was. In fact, my father visited her in hospital in Bermuda shortly before she died in 1976. And that was my father's last visit to Bermuda. So we'll carry on. So this artist's impression of the rescue appeared in Life magazine shortly after the event. As you can see, the rescuers had quite a job on their hands, rowing out from the tanker, seen top left with the searchlight, in heavy seas. Let us not forget that these were pioneering days. There was no life raft, no flares or emergency radio, no EPIRBs, no black box. The rescue in the pitch dark, in the middle of the Atlantic in January, in rough seas, nearly 300 miles from the nearest land, really was an absolute miracle. And so the survivors arrived in New York aboard the rescue ship, the tanker S.O. Baytown, to the glare of the world's press. You will see Edna Watson in the fur hat in 2 of the pictures on the left-hand side. The lady second from left in the upper picture, and on the right-hand side in the lower picture, again with her fur hat on. So this was the first ever loss of a commercial aircraft in mid-ocean, hence the world interest. So having recovered from this ordeal, Roly returned to duties back in the UK. War broke out soon after his return, by which time Roly was back on the flying boat routes to Singapore and Durban, until with the defeat of France in May, and then with Italy joining the war in June, this was of course 1940, he ended up becoming stuck in Africa until October. On his return to the UK, and he returned actually by sea, he was almost immediately sent down to Lagos, Nigeria, tasked with returning General de Gaulle back to London. Although the trip was shrouded in secrecy for obvious reasons, there were, of course, risks involved, not least keeping clear of the Luftwaffe between Gibraltar and the English Channel. And in fact, they narrowly avoided a potential poisoning attempt when they stopped at Freetown, Sierra Leone, which you can read more about in the book. Soon after this delivery run, Roly was assigned to a vital new role as one of a small band of elite pilots flying the 3 massive Boeing flying boats, which the UK government had purchased from the Americans in order to maintain the vital transatlantic link during the war. As you can see, these were huge machines, with a wingspan 3/4 the size of a jumbo jet. In fact, they were so big that a mechanic could actually walk through the wings during flight to carry out any vital adjustments. These beasts were pretty tricky to fly, as Boeing's test pilot commented, keeping the aircraft straight was akin to herding a reluctant buffalo. One of Roly's jobs was to bring across supplies of Cuban cigars for Churchill, which were a personal gift from President Roosevelt. They were delivered direct from Washington to the flying boat at Baltimore, and then transferred to the bullion hold on the night train direct from Poole to London. Churchill flew aboard one of these big Boeings back to the UK from Bermuda after vital talks with President Roosevelt. And it was the Berwick on this particular trip. The other 2 were the Bristol and Bangor. For the technically minded, these were the long-range 314As. The 314A had a longer range, 5,200 miles as opposed to 3,500, and a greater service ceiling, nearly 20,000 foot, as against 3,400. This memorable flight with Churchill took place on the 15th of January 1942, with Churchill returning across the Atlantic aboard the Berwick. This flight was later dubbed the most daring flight of the war. Churchill commented favorably on the comfort. He was accommodated in the bridal suite, as well as the fine food served on board. And we know that they had shrimp cocktail, cold buffet, chicken, ham, beetroot, Bartlett pears with cream, and coffee. Although they were nearly shot down twice. A squadron of Luftwaffe fighters were scrambled from Brittany to intercept them after a navigational error almost landed them on top of the German guns on the Brest Peninsula. As you can see from this cartoon, they failed dismally. Then, as the Boeing approached Plymouth from the south, it was picked up by our radar and was thought to be an enemy aircraft. As Churchill laconically commented later, the squadron of Hurricanes sent out to shoot us down also failed in their mission. So finally, after 3.5 years and 500,000 miles, Roly's time on the big Boeings came to an end. As the war drew to a close, BOAC were looking ahead to renewed commercial operations. And Roly was appointed flight captain of the line responsible for the fleet serving the Africa, India, and Australia routes, which were served by Dakotas, Yorks, Halifaxes, and Lancastrians. And many of these aircraft were fitted with the iconic 27-litre Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, 1,500 horsepower V12s, the same engines used in the Spitfire. In 1946, Roly was put in charge of the BOAC development flight, which entailed assessing the suitability of many different types of aircraft for BOAC's post-war needs. This involved proving flights, testing these machines in all sorts of countries and climates. Like this. Note the very modern technical ground support crew. This is an Avro Tudor on a proving flight down to Africa in 1947. The Tudor turned out to be unsuitable ultimately and was rejected. The British government was desperate to buy British, as the coffers were all but empty after the war. But there was just simply nothing suitable. With great reluctance, they were forced to look across the Atlantic. This is the Stratocruiser, one of them. They also bought Constellations, but this is the Stratocruiser, actually quite an interesting aircraft, a bit like an upside-down 747 Jumbo, in that there was a VIP lounge with a fully equipped bar in the underbelly. But it was only used by the captain to entertain any passengers he chose to invite down there. Meanwhile, back at the de Havilland base at Hatfield, much research and development had been going on to produce the first ever commercial jetliner, the Comet. Roly was now appointed manager of the Comet Development Unit and worked closely with the de Havilland team in preparation for the Comet's introduction as the world's first passenger jet. When the Comet entered service with BAOC, amidst huge international acclaim, Roly Alderson was appointed fleet manager. And here he is in the middle in front of his team. And behind the aircraft, just in the blurred distance, you can just about see some cranes and the beginnings of buildings. That's actually the beginning of the Queen's Building at Heathrow. Roly became the first ever commercial pilot to fly a passenger jet in the world. Obviously, there were the test pilots. Cunningham was the chief test pilot. The Comet saga is well known. It was withdrawn from service after less than 2 years in service due to design and manufacturing flaws, which led to a number of serious accidents. By the time these issues had been resolved, America had seized the initiative and forged ahead in the passenger jet race. After the Comet, Roly went on to become BAEC's technical manager of flight operations. One of his last tasks in this role was in the layout of Concorde's cockpit for the BA pilots. Here's Roly's old pal, the British Aerospace chief test pilot, Brian Trubshaw, known to his friends as Grub Screw, at the controls of Concorde 002. Captain Roly Alderson retired in 1966. During his career, he had piloted 180 aircraft of nearly 50 different types, from the Lynx to the Comet. He had flown a total of 37 flying boats and had logged some 11,000 hours in the air. More than half of those hours had been spent commanding boats. Until his death in 1993, Bermuda remained forever in Roly's heart, and he never forgot the kindness shown to him after the Cavalier incident by the Bermudian people. Thank you for joining. It's been fun this evening.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Mark. That was absolutely fascinating. And I actually have a picture of Edna that I use in one of the slides in my teaching of her placing a vote into the election box, and at the bottom it talks about her. So that's absolutely fantastic. Now I'm going to open up the floor to people for questions. You could either type away in the chat, or please feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Open the chat there.
Okay, you should be able to unmute yourselves if you have any questions.
Okay, that's where you'll see any questions. Okay.
Yep.
Hello, Mark. This is Mark Orchard. Thank you very much for that fascinating discussion and the history of your father. I was wondering, I wasn't quite clear if during the war he only flew the flying boats, or did he also fly in the war for the RAF?
No, he was with Imperial. Well, in fact, they became BOAC at the beginning of the war. So he just flew those flying boats. And he flew them until the war was drawing to a close towards the end of 1944. So he was the majority of the war, almost all of it. He was, of course, the first part, he was stuck in Africa. If you may remember, he came back after the Cavalier incident. He came back to the UK and was put back onto the routes to Singapore and down to Durban, down the Nile. And they flew across France until, of course, the Germans invaded France. And then they had to go round. They routed round well outside Biscay to avoid interception by the Luftwaffe. And then as the war progressed, then he got stuck in South Africa, came back by ship, and was then transferred onto the big Boeings. But he was never in the RAF. He was always with Imperial and then BOAC.
This is a follow-up. Have you any idea how many of the flying boats that Imperial had in its fleet?
Not offhand. I mean, the attrition rate was pretty major. So much so that they persuaded yeah, what was it? Anyway, one of the other airlines to hand over some aircraft, some short C class that were due to them. They let Imperial have them because various ones had crashed, and there's quite a history of the various crashes that occurred. So they lost quite a few in the early years through various things.
And perhaps just one last question. Will your book be available here in Bermuda?
I hope it's on the way. I think, Meredith, can we unmute you? I think you have some information on that.
Yeah, the Bermuda bookstore has ordered it, so it will be available there. I understand they haven't arrived yet, but they have ordered some books, and the Bermuda Library will be ordering some books as well. So they should be, they will be available here shortly.
Excuse me, could I ask a question? I see that there's someone called Alexander Frith on the chat, and I wonder if he was related to the Friths of salt cattle that were on board the flight, or his grandparents, survivors of the crash.
No, the Friths weren't on the flight, but they were very old friends of my father.
Oh, you mentioned, okay, they were friends. Okay.
They were friends, and I remember we used to visit the Friths whenever we went to Bermuda on holiday, and when I was a youngster, we would always visit the Friths. They were very hospitable, and we spent quite a bit of time down at Salt Cattle.
Thank you.
I'm there, shown as Alexander Frith. I'm in fact better known as John. Mary and Zondi are my parents. I was born about 3 months before the Czech Cavalier went down, but I did have several, at a very early age, passages from Bermuda to Baltimore on board the flying boats. I grew up in Mizentop, which is it was a bit of a guest house, which is where Roly and Taffy used to spend time. I do, in fact, remember them. And it's up on the hill overlooking the Granaway Deep in Bermuda, which is where the big flying boats would take off and shake the whole countryside because the noise and the energy that came up. And yeah, in any case, I remember the era well, and how could we forget it? And that's really why I'm here today. Mark, it's very good to hear from you. Makes us sort of cousins in a way, doesn't it?
Sort of, yes, indeed. Thank you, John. Lovely to meet you.
And yeah, my parents always spoke so well of Roly as being their very closest friends back in their early married days in Bermuda. So
thank you. Well, likewise, John. My parents were always so fond of your parents. And as I say, I remember time spent down on the quay down at Salt Kettle, quayside. And in fact, I think it may have been your sister. I think my older brother, had a little dalliance with your sister.
It's her birthday on Monday, and we just celebrated it because my brother Michael, they're all my junior, but we're still close together in Bermuda. So we just saw Wendy, my sister, and we were hoping they'd all be able to join us in watching this, but they all had to go off in all directions. So anyway, thank you very much for this, and
look forward to getting the book.
We'll certainly get the book as soon as we can.
Thank you, John. Well, lovely to meet you. If I ever get out to Bermuda, I would love to come back. I've got so many fond memories of Bermuda. I would dearly love to visit again.
Well, we're living in Salt Kettle now, and easy to find. And my brother's right next door, so just look for Frith Salt Kettle, and we're here.
That's great to hear. If I can sell enough books, I'll be on the first plane.
Well, good luck for that.
Do we have any other questions?
Hello, it's Paul Sheehan speaking. I joined the group today from Australia. I have not met Mark, but we've had quite a lot of communication between us. I grew up with flying boats in Auckland, New Zealand. As a 6-year-old, my grandmother lived near the harbour, and we would go to visit her, and I'd make any excuse I could to leave the meeting with my grandmother and go and sit on the ferry wharf at the harbour, because at 6 years of age, I knew every time that the flying boats left and came in, and I would do everything in my power to get there on the wharf and watch them. So my love of flying boats has gone on and on to the point where I've just finished a 580-page history on the Empire flying boats. I'm trying to get it published at the moment. I'm having great difficulty because everybody's saying to me, "Oh, it's too big," and I feel like saying to them, "How do you write the complete history of 42 flying boats on the back of a postage stamp?" So currently I have it with the Oxford University Press. It's under consideration for publishing, and hopefully that will come through. Roly and I have met each other, but not physically, through an organisation called the Poole Flying Boat Celebration. Yes. And they keep all the records of all the flying boats that came and went through Poole in England right throughout the war years. And I was invited to write a review of Roly's book, which I did, and I got my copy straight away. It is the most wonderful book I think I've ever read, particularly in the flying boat chapters. And I was very glad that I could help him with quite a bit of information. So the first gentleman that came on to speak asked about how many flying boats there were. There were 42 built. 6 of them were actually went to Qantas Airways in Australia. 2 went to Tasman Empire Airways in New Zealand, and the remainder of them operated only with Imperial and BOAC. So it's so nice to be able to hear Mark's summary of what his dad did, and a most extraordinary brave man that saved people's lives. And yeah, he'll be always in my mind, that's for sure.
Well, thank you, Paul. Lovely to see you. Thank you very much for that. Very kind words. I should say, have you approached, out of interest, Air World, part of Pen and Sword?
Not yet. I have been thinking about doing that because there are a couple of other gentlemen in the UK who are part of the Poole Flying Boat celebration, and they have had books successfully published through Pen and Sword. I've just been having a look at their website, and they're going to be the next ones that I approach.
Well, John Grehan was the one that I approached, who took my book, and he's a good person to. He is the chap. He's really the commissioning editor. So,
terrific!
He would be the chap to speak to.
Yes, it's a large book because I have actually had access to the original records from BOAC, or British Airways Heritage Museum, and they are around 1,500 huge pages, handwritten, of where every one of the Empire flying boats was at for every single day of their lives. And I have extracted each flying boat out of those 1,500 pages and made a complete history of the movements of every one of the flying boats individually, and all the things that they did along the way. And so this has never ever been done before, and it's an opportunity to save this information, because we're talking of flying boats that would have now been over 80 years old, and unfortunately I think they will be forgotten in due time. And so my mission was to save all of this information for future generations.
Wow.
I would like.
Yeah, I'm just conscious of time.
Sure.
I have to wind you up in a minute.
Is there anybody else here with a question for Mark?
Yeah, it's Simon from London. I very much enjoyed your book, Mark, and as well as your presentation. Can you just give us any sort of detail about why your father had such a passion for flying and took it up after finishing university, or maybe during university? But what really made him have this passion for flying?
Simon, I think it was, if you remember, I think it is in the book, at the age of 12, Ross Smith broke the record flying the big Vickers Vimy bomber from London to Australia. And I think that captured his imagination. And, and from then on, he decided he wanted to fly. And that, combined with his, he started building his own motor car at the age of 14. And it was road registered, again, it's in the book, it was road registered pretty well on his 17th birthday. So he was very much, interested in engineering. And when he went to Cambridge to study engineering, aeronautics was part of the engineering degree.
Right.
So, and he jumped into the Cambridge University Air Squadron at the first opportunity. The University Air Squadron had only been in being for barely 2 years, so he was quite an early member. But
Thank you.
What fired him up, I think, was flight.
Yeah, and then you've got to.
Thank you. Any further questions?
Yes, I have one. I'm actually not my picture is not there, but I'm sitting next to my husband, Richard Baker. Just like to comment, following on Simon, Mark, we very, very much enjoyed your book. We're going to reread it now that we've heard a little bit more. But I just wanted to share the fact that Harriet is online, Harriet Baker. That Harriet is our daughter-in-law. Harriet is Mark's daughter. And if Edna Watson had not saved Roly, Mark wouldn't be here, Harriet wouldn't be here, and our 3 grandchildren wouldn't be here. So just a little personal story, but we very much enjoyed your book. The other question, Mark, we will be able to access this online after we go offline tonight?
Yeah, not this evening. Yeah, shall I just step in there, Mark? Not this evening. It is being recorded and it will be available on the YouTube, I'll start again, on the Bermuda National Trust's YouTube channel at some point next week.
Okay, and given that I've got a little bit of an inside running, being my grandchildren, Mark's grandchildren as well, Mark, would you mind sending us a link when you know that's up?
Yeah, no, by all means, I can do that.
Thank you.
I will email Mark as soon as the link is up, and then Mark can pass that on. But it's just the Bermuda National Trust. If you type that into YouTube, you'll see all our videos there.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody, I think we're going to wrap it up. I just want to finish by saying thank you again, Mark, for your time in putting this presentation together. I know it was a time consuming for you to condense everything into half an hour with a specific focus on Bermuda. So we truly, truly appreciate your time. Thank you so much to everybody that's come today. Your support is wonderful, and even more so because we're spanning the globe this afternoon, this morning, and this evening. So take care, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Please keep an ear and an eye out for future Trust Talks. And again, thank you for being here. Thank you so much, Mark.
Pleasure. Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you all for coming. It's been a pleasure.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.